They were mothers, daughters, students, even police officers, women you might pass on the street without a second glance. But behind their ordinary exteriors hid something far more sinister. Cold, calculated, unforgiving. These women didn't just commit murder. They orchestrated it with chilling precision. Driven by jealousy, greed, obsession, or pure malice, they shattered lives and left permanent scars on their communities. Their names are etched into court records and whispered in prison corridors. This isn't about crimes of passion. This is about premeditated evil. These are the most dangerous women on death row in America, and their stories are more disturbing than you think. Case 1, Lisa Jo Chamberlain. It started in Hattiesburg, Mississippi in 2004. Lisa and her boyfriend Roger Gillette were staying with two friends, 34-year-old Vernon Hewlett and his girlfriend, 37-year-old Linda Heinzelman. It was supposed to be temporary, a place to crash, but tension quickly turned to violence. Chamberlain and Gillette believed the couple had wronged them over money, drugs, or something more personal. The exact motive remains clouded, but what's clear is the brutality that followed. Vernon was the first. He was beaten, tortured, and eventually suffocated. Linda was forced to watch before she became the next victim, suffocated with a plastic bag. Both of their bodies were mutilated, dismembered with cold precision. What couldn't be burned or buried was packed into a deep freezer. Lisa and Roger loaded the freezer with the bodies inside into a trailer and drove it 600 miles northwest to an abandoned farmhouse in Kansas. They left it in a garage to rot. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Authorities in Kansas, acting on a tip, discovered the freezer weeks later. When they pried it open, the smell was overwhelming. Inside, the decomposing remains of Vernon and Linda, their bodies butchered, wrapped in plastic, limbs frozen in unnatural positions. An electric carving knife and bone saw were recovered nearby. Lisa didn't confess. She claimed she was a bystander, just caught up in Roger's rage. But the evidence, her fingerprints, her words of friends, her failure to stop it, told a different story. In 2006, Lisa Jo Chamberlain was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder. And for the first time in over 3 decades, Mississippi sentenced a woman to death. She now sits in a solitary cell at Central Mississippi Correctional Facility, the only woman on the state's death row. In May 2025, the Mississippi Supreme Court denied her post-conviction petition, raising the possibility that an execution date may soon be requested. No execution date has been set, but the horror she helped create is sealed in that freezer forever. Case 2, Shauna Ford. On the night of May 30th, 2009, 2 men and a woman forced their way into a home in Arivica, Arizona. They were dressed like law enforcement, claiming it was an immigration raid. Inside the home were 29-year-old Raul Flores, his wife Gina Gonzalez, and their 9-year-old daughter Brazenia. The intruders demanded money, ransacked the house, and opened fire. Raul was shot multiple times and killed instantly. Gina, though badly wounded, survived by playing dead. Then came the moment no one could comprehend. As Brazenia begged for her life, one of the attackers reloaded his weapon and shot her in the head. A second shot followed. Gina would later testify from her hospital bed, describing how her daughter's last words were, "Please don't shoot me. I don't want to die." The woman behind the attack was 41-year-old Shauna Ford, a fringe anti-immigration activist and the self-declared leader of the Minutemen American Defense, a militia group often armed and unsupervised. Ford wanted funding and believed that robbing Latino families she suspected of drug ties would provide the money her group needed. There was no evidence that Raul Flores was involved in drug trafficking. None. He worked at a local foundry and lived quietly with his family. Ford orchestrated the entire plan and recruited 2 men, Jason Eugene Bush and Albert Gaxiola, to carry out the raid with her. Bush was a shooter, but Ford wasn't just a bystander. She was at the scene giving orders and collecting stolen jewelry. Less than 2 weeks later, all 3 were arrested. During her trial, prosecutors revealed disturbing details. Ford had a long history of deception and instability, falsely claiming to be a federal agent, faking a molestation, and even staging her own assault to garner sympathy. The jury didn't take long. In February 2011, Shauna Ford was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and multiple count of robbery and aggravated assault. The verdict, death. She is currently one of only a handful of women on Arizona's death row, held at the Lumley unit in Perryville. She has shown no remorse, no apology, in prison. She continues to write and publish manifestos claiming innocence and portray herself as a political prisoner. Case 3, Brittany Hallberg. On November 13, 1996, police in Amarillo, Texas, responded to a wellness check at the home of 80-year-old A.B. Towery Sr. What they found inside would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. Towery had been stabbed more than 60 times. His face beaten, his body bruised, bloodied, and left sprawled across the floor of his own living room. And most disturbing of all, a butter knife jammed so deep into his throat it had to be surgically removed during the autopsy. The killer, a 23-year-old woman named Brittany Hallberg. Hallberg was no stranger to chaos. She had a long history of drug addiction and prostitution. That day, she had reportedly been out looking for drugs when she ended up at Towery's home. The elderly man had known her, even helped her before, by some accounts. He let her in willingly, possibly offering her a place to rest or something to eat. But what followed was anything but kindness. Hallberg would later claim she acted in self-defense, saying Towery attacked her first. But the evidence told a very different story. Investigators found signs of prolonged struggle. Forensic analysis showed that several weapons had been used: a paring knife, a fork, a lamp, and the now infamous butter knife. After killing Towery, Hallberg stole his wallet, his credit cards, and his car keys. She used his money to buy drugs, checked into a motel, and continued using for days. When police finally caught up with her in Memphis, Tennessee, over 600 miles away, she was hiding in a closet. In March 1998, Brittany Hallberg was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. In March 2025, the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals vacated her conviction and death sentence due to issues with critical evidence, remanding the case to a lower court. She is no longer on death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, though her legal proceedings continue. During her time incarcerated, she's given multiple interviews claiming abuse, mistreatment, and wrongful conviction. Case 4, Maureen McDermott. She didn't get blood on her hands. She paid someone else to do it for her. The victim was Stephen Eldridge, a 27-year-old man working as a hospital orderly in North Hollywood, California. In 1985, he moved into a shared home with Maureen McDermott, a registered nurse, thinking it was just a simple roommate arrangement. What he didn't know was that Maureen had already decided he was worth more dead than alive. Behind the scenes, she had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on Stephen, naming herself as the sole beneficiary. There was no legitimate reason for the policy, no marriage, no business connection, just proximity and opportunity. On April 28, 1985, Maureen lured Stephen to the house. Waiting for him was James H. Stockwell, a former patient of McDermott and a man she had manipulated into becoming her accomplice. As Stephen entered the home, Stockwell attacked, stabbing him 27 times. The violence was excessive, brutal, personal. But for Maureen, it was just business, to cover her tracks. She and Stockwell staged the scene to look like a break-in, ransacking the home and scattering items to confuse investigators. But it didn't take long for detectives to notice that something was off. The investigation unraveled quickly. When Stockwell was questioned, he cracked. He confessed to the killing and revealed Maureen's role in the plot. In court, he testified that she had promised him to share the insurance payout and even a future together. In 1990, Maureen McDermott was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances of financial gain and was sentenced to death. Today, she remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, one of the longest-serving female inmates in the state's condemned unit. She has spent more than 3 decades behind bars, filing appeal after appeal, all while maintaining that she never meant for Stephen to die. But the truth is hard to escape. Case 5, Linda Carty. In May 2001, a young mother was found dead, tied up, suffocated, and discarded like trash. Her newborn baby was missing. The killer, a woman who wanted a child and was willing to take one by force. Linda Carty, a former schoolteacher and drug informant originally.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Desperate to convince her partner she had just given birth, and under pressure in a strained relationship, Cardi came up with a plan. She would steal a baby, and to do that, she would have to kill a mother. The victim was Joanna Rodriguez, a 20-year-old woman living in Houston with her partner and their newborn son. On the night of May 16th, masked men burst into Joanna's apartment. They tied her up and beat her boyfriend before forcing her into a car and driving off into the dark. Those men, Gerald Anderson, Chris Robinson, and Carlos Williams, were later revealed to be Cardi's accomplices. The plan was simple: abduct Joanna, take her baby, and leave behind no witnesses. Joanna was placed in the trunk of a car, gagged, bound, struggling to breathe. By the time police located the vehicle the next day, it was too late. Joanna Rodriguez had suffocated. Her newborn son, found alive nearby, had miraculously survived. Investigators quickly traced the crime back to Linda Cardi. She had posed as a federal officer to gain access to Joanna's home earlier in the week. She had talked about needing a baby, and after the murder, she made claims that the kidnapped child was hers. The motive? Cardi believed that convincing her partner she had recently given birth would help regain custody of her own biological daughter, from whom she was estranged, and stabilize her relationship. The lie was as bizarre as it was deadly. During her trial, prosecutors laid out the facts in brutal detail. Cardi had orchestrated the entire crime. The jury didn't hesitate. In 2002, Linda Cardi was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. She became the first British citizen on death row in the United States, igniting a wave of international attention. Cardi has since become the subject of documentaries, advocacy campaigns, and celebrity appeals, all arguing that she didn't get a fair trial, but her conviction still stands. Today, she sits on death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, continuing to claim innocence, even as the evidence points to deliberate planning, abduction, and murder. Case 6. Amelia Carr. It was March 2009 when 26-year-old Amelia Lily Carr, 6 months pregnant, committed a murder that was as intimate as it was horrifying. The victim was Heather Strong, a 26-year-old mother of 2 who had recently married Carr's ex-boyfriend, Joshua Fogum. The three were entangled in a bitter, chaotic love triangle, but none of it prepared anyone for what would come next. After Fogum manipulated Heather into signing over custody of their children, he and Carr began plotting something darker. On March 24th, Fogum lured Heather to a storage shed behind his parents' trailer, a small, secluded structure on rural property in Marion County. Waiting inside was Amelia Carr. Heather was ambushed. She was tied to a chair with duct tape, her mouth gagged, her body restrained. Then the garbage can was brought in. Carr and Fogum forced Heather into it, legs first, folding her body into the plastic drum as she struggled to breathe. Then Carr held the lid closed for several agonizing minutes. Face to face, breath to breath, Carr smothered her. After Heather stopped moving, they left her body in the shed. Her remains were found nearly a month later, decomposed and sealed in the same container where she had taken her last breath. When questioned, Carr initially denied everything, but under pressure, she broke. She confessed in a videotaped statement detailing how Fogum planned the killing and how she participated willingly. Carr even made audio recordings with her father, joking and laughing about the crime. She later tried to recant her confession, blaming fear and confusion, but by then, the damage was done. In 2010, Amelia Carr was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The jury recommended death by a 7-5 vote, and she was sentenced accordingly, becoming one of only a handful of women on Florida's death row. At the time of her sentencing, her child, born in prison, was placed into foster care. But in 2017, a new chapter began. After Florida revised its death penalty statutes, requiring unanimous jury recommendations for capital punishment, Carr's sentence was overturned. Prosecutors chose not to pursue death again. Her sentence was officially commuted to life without parole. Today, Amelia Carr remains in prison at the Lell Correctional Institution. She will never walk free, but her case continues to disturb those who remember it. Case 7, Krista Pike. In January 1995, 18-year-old Krista Gale Pike committed one of the most sadistic murders in Tennessee's history. Not in secret, not in shame, but with open pride. Her victim was Colleen Slemmer, a 19-year-old fellow student at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville. Both girls had enrolled in the federally funded vocational program to turn their lives around. But inside the dorms, tension grew fast. Krista, known for her erratic behavior and obsession with the occult, became convinced that Colleen was trying to steal her boyfriend Tatterall's ship. Jealousy turned to hatred, and then to ritualistic violence. On the night of January 12, 1995, Krista lured Colleen out of the center under the pretense of smoking marijuana. Ship and another student, Shadala Peterson, followed. The group led Colleen to a remote steam plant near the University of Tennessee campus. What Colleen didn't know was that she was being led to her death. Over the next 30 to 40 minutes, Krista and Ship tortured Colleen. They beat her, carved a pentagram into her chest with a box cutter, stomped on her neck, and finally Krista brought down a chunk of asphalt paving, smashing Colleen's skull with such force that part of her brain was exposed. When it was over, Krista kept a piece of Colleen's skull as a souvenir. She later showed it off to friends, bragged about the murder, told people it felt wonderful. It didn't take long for police to connect the dots. Krista and Ship were arrested the very next day. Inside Krista's jacket pocket, the blood-stained piece of bone. In her confession, she described the killing in disturbing detail, laughing, smiling, showing no remorse. She was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The trial lasted less than a week. In March 1996, Krista Pike was sentenced to death, becoming the youngest woman in the United States to receive the death penalty since it was reinstated in 1976. She was just 20 years old, but her violence didn't end there. In 2001, while on death row at the Tennessee Prison for Women, Krista attempted to strangle another inmate with a shoelace. That inmate survived. Krista was convicted of attempted murder and given 25 additional years. To this day, Krista Pike remains on death row, the only woman currently facing execution in Tennessee. Her appeals have been denied repeatedly, and in 2012, the state signed her death warrant, though the execution was later stayed. In 2020, another execution attempt was halted by a federal judge over lethal injection concerns. No new execution date has been set. Case 8, Antoinette Frank. On the night of March 4th, 1995, Officer Antoinette Frank of the New Orleans Police Department entered a Vietnamese restaurant she had frequented many times before, Kim On Restaurant in the city's East District. But this time, she wasn't there to eat. She was there to rob and to kill. Inside the restaurant were the owner, Ha Vu, her two children, Quang Vu, 17, and Ha Vu, 24, and Antoinette's own partner for the night, Officer Ronald A. Williams II, a 25-year-old rookie cop, riding along with Frank on patrol. Frank, accompanied by her boyfriend Rogers Lacaze, a known drug dealer and convicted felon, had planned a robbery in advance. She knew the layout, knew where the cash was stored, and she knew that the Vu family trusted her. Frank and Lacaze entered the restaurant armed. They quickly forced everyone to the back. That's when Officer Williams was shot point blank, executed by the very person he believed had his back. But it didn't end there. The Vu siblings, Quang and Ha, tried to hide inside the restaurant's walk-in cooler, but Frank and Lacaze found them. Both were gunned down without mercy. Ha Vu, the mother, survived, hiding and later playing dead, covered in blood, listening to her children die just feet away. Then came the final insult. After the massacre, Antoinette Frank returned to the scene, pretending she had just arrived to respond to the shooting. She approached other officers with her weapon holstered, playing the role of a shocked first responder, but her act unraveled quickly. Ha Vu, barely able to speak through her injuries, pointed at Frank in horror, identifying her as one of the shooters. Officers detained Frank on the spot. Evidence piled up fast. Ballistic testing matched her department-issued handgun to multiple shell casings found at the scene. Witnesses testified that Frank had allowed LeKay's unauthorized access to her police cruiser and had been seen with him at the restaurant earlier that evening. Her motive? Money. She was deeply in debt, facing suspension from the force, and living in a web of lies. The badge wasn't a symbol of service. It was her cover. In 1995, Antoinette Frank was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Her trial shocked the city, not just because of the crime, but because of who committed it. She became the first female officer in modern U.S. history to receive the death penalty for a crime committed in uniform. Her accomplice, Rogers LeKay, was also convicted and sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. Today, Antoinette Frank remains on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, one of the most infamous inmates the state has ever held. In January 2025, the Louisiana Pardon Board denied her clemency request. She now faces a scheduled execution, though no specific date has been confirmed. Case 9, Wendy Andriano. In the early hours of October 8, 2000, paramedics were called to an apartment in Phoenix, Arizona. Wendy Andriano, 30 years old, stood outside hysterical, claiming her husband had collapsed. Inside, they found Joe Andriano on the floor, his skull shattered, blood pooling around his head. He was already gone. Joe was 33, diagnosed with terminal adenoid cystic carcinoma, a rare form of cancer. Weak, emaciated, and under hospice care, he could barely speak. He depended on Wendy for everything: meals, medication, daily care, and she used that dependence to kill him. Autopsy revealed 2 disturbing things. First, Joe had been poisoned. Second, when the poison didn't kill him fast enough, Wendy beat him to death with a barbell, fracturing his skull and face with multiple blows. She didn't stop there. She stabbed him repeatedly in the neck with a kitchen knife, then dialed 911, crying and screaming that her husband had attacked her. She claimed self-defense, but the scene told a different story. Joe had no defensive wounds, no strength to fight. He weighed just over 130 pounds, a man dying by inches, barely able to walk. Investigators quickly began unraveling Wendy's lies. In the months leading up to the murder, she had tried to convince doctors to stop hospice care so she could resume treatment decisions. She told friends Joe was worsening, that he wanted to die. But behind the scenes, she was having affairs and frequenting bars. Evidence showed she had searched for poisons, made multiple calls asking about chemical access, and told friends she didn't want to be stuck in a marriage to a dying man. At trial, Wendy played the role of the grieving, battered wife. She claimed Joe had become controlling and abusive, that he attacked her that night, and she was forced to defend herself. But the forensic evidence dismantled that story. In 2004, Wendy Andriano was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder. The jury voted for the death penalty, citing cruelty, the vulnerable condition of the victim, and elaborate deception she used before and after the murder. She remains on Arizona's death row at the Perryville Prison Complex, one of just a few women facing execution in the state. Case 10, Kimberly Cargill. She killed to keep a secret buried, and chose a vulnerable woman to silence forever. The victim was Cherry Walker, a 39-year-old woman with intellectual disabilities who lived in Tyler, Texas. Gentle, trusting, and socially limited, Cherry lived under guardianship and relied heavily on the support of others. She loved helping people, and one of the people she helped most was Kimberly Cargill. Cargill, a single mother of 4, often used Cherry as a babysitter for her youngest son. On paper, she was a hardworking nurse. But behind the scenes, Child Protective Services had opened an investigation against her for alleged abuse and neglect. Cherry had been subpoenaed to testify in the CPS case. She knew things that could destroy Cargill's chances of keeping custody, and Cargill knew it. So she made a decision not to fight the case, but to eliminate the witness. On the night of June 18, 2010, Cargill picked up Cherry under the pretense of taking her to court the next day. But Cherry never made it. Instead, somewhere between Tyler and White House, Cargill strangled her. Then she drove to a remote area near County Road 219, dumped Cherry's body in a ditch, and set on fire. When police found the remains the next morning, they were so badly burned that identification required dental records. There were no signs of defensive wounds. Cargill quickly became the prime suspect. Investigators found gasoline traces on her clothing. Phone records placed her in the area where the body was dumped. She lied repeatedly about where Cherry had been when she last saw her and the upcoming court date. Then came the most damning detail. Cherry was due in court the very next day to testify against a woman who killed her. At trial, prosecutors painted Cargill as a cold manipulator, someone who exploited Cherry's trust, used her when convenient, and discarded her when she became a threat. They revealed a pattern of control, violence, and lies spanning years. Former partners testified about physical abuse. CPS workers described Cargill's history of evasion and denial. In 2012, Kimberly Cargill was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. She was one of several women on Texas death row held at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville. In February 2025, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted Cargill a new trial due to withheld evidence, vacating her conviction. She remains incarcerated pending retrial, no longer on death row, though she continues to maintain her innocence. Each of these women sits behind concrete and steel, untouched by time, while the memories of their victims are etched into eternity. Most of them will wait decades. Some may never face execution at all. But time doesn't erase what they did. Because once you've crossed that final line, once you've killed with intent, calculation, and no remorse, you carry a title few can ever shed. The most evil women on death row in America. These women now live in shadows, locked behind bars, but the horror of their crimes still echoes. Their victims, some forgotten, others remembered, deserve more than silence. They deserve truth, justice, and never to be erased. As you sit with the weight of these stories, ask yourself, what drives a person to such darkness? And how many more walk among us, hiding their true nature? If this episode gripped you, subscribe for more true crime breakdowns like this one. Like, share, and leave a comment. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and stay safe.